much, Sharon, for taking time with us.
Thank you.
First, can you explain a little bit about your new book, This Naked City? So what was your objective of writing this? What did you want to tell to the readers?
Two times in the past I have written books about changes in New York City. Once, in the 1980s, I wrote Loft Living about the very surprising emergence of manufacturing lofts as a living space, first for artists and then for people with high educations and high incomes. In that book, I signaled the beginning of the symbolic economy in very large cities as a motor of economic growth and a set of strategies of social prestige. Then, 10 years later, I wrote a book, The Cultures of Cities, where I talked about the expansion of the symbolic economy through the public spaces of the city and through the expansion of art museums, the growth of art museums, changes in shopping districts. By the 2000s, I thought it was time once again to look back over the previous 30 years of change that some people call neoliberalism, that we see reflected in the upscaling of big cities. We see this upscaling in two senses. First, the buildings become taller and taller, and second, the prices become higher, and the city is less affordable as a place for many people to live. Through the process of gentrification, we see the importance of culture in displacing populations that had lived in their districts of the city for many years. But because the price of housing rises, we see that they can no longer afford to stay where they belong. And many of them sell their houses. Others who rent their apartments cannot pay the higher rents. Whether they sell or they cannot rent, they are displaced in some ways. And even if they remain in the neighborhoods, they feel culturally displaced because there are new stores, new businesses, new people around them, and it is no longer the same neighborhood that they knew. So I wrote Naked City to remind people of the authentic city, diverse, lively, gritty, a little bit dirty, creative, in a very varied sense. This is the city that people think of when they see movies about New York. And I chose the title Naked City because of the black and white film noir from 1948 by that title, which was the first film to shoot on location in the streets of New York, and that showed the New York that we think of as the authentic city. Low scale, working class people, people who go about their everyday business outside of the world of big business and big politics. And it's that city, a city of neighborhoods, a city of villages, that I wanted to write about. All big cities are like this: Tokyo, New York, London, Paris. But it's something that we forget, this small scale of local neighborhoods. We forget in these years of globalization, talk about growth and building high rises for high incomes.
So with these changes, what is the thing that the city of New York is losing?
The city is losing its diversity. Its tolerance for difference. Its ability to put together the high and the low, the rich and the poor, living not in the same house perhaps, but living in the same neighborhood, the small business, the local owners. We're losing all of that. We see that in changes on local shopping streets. You know, every neighborhood has its own little ginza, as you pointed out to me in Tokyo. We have our little main street, which is the main shopping street of a neighborhood. In the past, most of the stores and restaurants and other businesses on these little local shopping streets were owned by New York people. They were not branches of chains. And they sold the everyday things that people need. We would say the bread and butter stores. Stores where you buy eggs and fish and milk and vegetables, that fruits, which you need every day. And by the way, I do think food stores are very important in maintaining the local character of a shopping street. So in New York now, we have many branches of global chains. We have many clothing stores. We have many bank branches. We have fast food restaurants instead of old-fashioned diners. And all of these changes we think are typical of modern life. And they are in terms of the big scale of enterprises represented here. But really we're losing our emotional attachment to the geography of our neighborhood by losing the local character of these shopping streets. But shopping streets are the public face of all the other changes that are going on. We can't look into everybody's apartment to see who is living there. But on the local shopping street, we see who is walking there, who is shopping there, who is working in the stores. We see the kinds of products that are being sold, and we form a judgment about the residents of the neighborhood. We feel comfortable on this shopping street, or we feel uncomfortable. And this sense of comfort, I think, is what we're losing when we lose the authentic city.
But the things you just pointed out has been already missed, or it didn't even exist at the beginning in the suburbs. Or am I right? That's true. The
city is different from the suburbs because of the heterogeneous uses, the different uses of space. Certainly many people prefer to live in the suburbs because of the homogeneous use of space and apparent homogeneity of people, at least in the past, who live in the suburb, who live in each suburb. But in recent years, I think many people miss this sense of liveliness, this sense of difference that you can appreciate in the city, even if the other people are strangers. You can appreciate the smell, the sight, the sound of vitality, of difference, of many different people going about their business. This is part of the basic definition of urban life.
Okay. Especially in New York.
Well, especially in New York, but really in every big city. I mean, maybe in New York we have more difference or more differences, different kinds of difference. But certainly because of immigration, historically, New York has many different ethnic groups, many languages, religions, different kinds of people. But every city has migrants as well as native-born people. In fact, I saw a documentary film made by the French filmmaker Agnès Varda, V-A-R-D-A, in the 1960s. This is a film that Varda made of the street where she lives in Montmartre in Paris. And she was very, very fascinated by the specific character of each store. And these were all little stores, each store on her street. And she was captivated by the specific characteristics of each store owner, even though their routine is the same every day. And this routine, of course, requires them to serve their customers. Nonetheless, Varda was fascinated by the, how can I say, the beauty of life and the rhythms of life on this shopping street every day. So she interviewed every store owner on her street, and she found that many of them are not born in Paris. One was born in Algeria, but the others were all born in rural regions. So this street, which to her as well as to an outsider, looks like the essence of Paris life, in fact is a social construction of migrants to the city. So what I want to say is that a shopping street in a city is not only the public face of the city, public face of the district, but it really represents the cultural DNA of the biology of the district. But this DNA may be produced by people who come from many different places. They may be French but not from Paris, or they may come from many different countries of the world.
Can you give me some example in New York neighborhoods how this DNA works?
Well, I'll tell you about Orchard Street on the Lower East Side. This is a street where I have done research with a colleague and 10 graduate students. Orchard Street is a well-known street for low price or discount shopping. At least it was this kind of street in the past.
So it was a retail.
It was many retail stores, mostly not food stores. The street, I suppose, in the 17th century when New York was New Amsterdam, a colony of the Dutch, I suppose there was an orchard there, and that's why the street was named Orchard Street. But from, let's say, the 1870s and 1880s, it has been a street of tenements, meaning 4- and 5-story buildings, built very poorly, with apartments that are relatively small, renting for low prices, mostly to immigrants of the working class. In the late 19th century, many of the immigrants were Jews who came from Russia and Eastern Europe. They lived there until the 1940s, 1950s. After the end of World War II, when the suburbs of New York began to be constructed with mass production of housing, many of those Jews moved away. Many of them earlier, in fact, had moved to Brooklyn or to other neighborhoods of New York City as they became more affluent and could afford to buy a house. By 1960, I would say, very few Jews remained as residents in that neighborhood. However, they remained as owners of stores because this was their way to earn a living. As residents, they were replaced by Latinos. First, Latinos from Puerto Rico who have come to New York City in great numbers during the whole course of the 20th century, but especially in the 1950s when they were recruited, brought to New York City to work in factories, even though the employment did not last a long time. But many of them worked in factories. And the public housing projects that were built by the city government on the Lower East Side to replace very bad housing, very poor, overcrowded housing, were filled after the 1950s with Latino residents. Maybe from 1980, the number of Chinese residents of the Lower East Side increased enormously, and increased even more after 1985 when immigration laws in the United States changed and many more Chinese immigrants came. And so Orchard Street as a shopping street had Jewish store owners selling very cheap products, mainly clothing, to Latino residents of the neighborhood. And some Chinese began to open stores at the southern end of Orchard Street near Chinatown to sell restaurant equipment or to print menus and other sorts of material for Chinese businesses in Chinatown. At the same time, from the 1980s, the stores on Orchard Street began to lose business to Walmart, Kmart, Target, the big box superstores, the big discount stores that opened in the suburbs.
Suburbs.
Yes. And it wasn't only residents of the Lower East Side who had come to Orchard Street. Orchard Street had really been an attraction for people looking for bargains from all of New York City and sometimes even from the suburbs until the competition from Walmart, Kmart, and Target, Costco, all of those stores became very, very serious.
That's
1980s, I'd say 1980s.
Okay.
And from that time, those stores began to experience perhaps some difficulties. Another kind of difficulty that they faced was the death and retirement of the older generation of Jewish owners who did not have a son or daughter to take over the business. Why? Because their sons and daughters had gone to college and become educated, and for the most part they did not want to be the owners of discount clothing stores. So many of those stores began to go out of business. At the
Not because they're doing a bad business.
Well, both because some of them because they're doing a bad business, some because the owner was too old and no one would take over the business. At the same time, an increasing number of immigrants from not Puerto Rico. They're not immigrants from Puerto Rico. They're Americans, so they would be migrants. But an increasing number of immigrants from China, as I said, opened stores on the south end of Orchard Street, but also immigrants from Bangladesh, Pakistan, perhaps India, also Russia, began to open stores that sold clothing, leather jackets, textiles, material to sew, perfumes on Orchard Street. So the character of the street, what we would call the ethnic character of the street, slightly changed, even though the products remained pretty much the same. Cheap clothing, cheap luggage, baggage, textiles, materials, and so on. And the merchants formed a street association to try to promote themselves. One way they promoted themselves was to influence the police department to close the street to automobile traffic on Sunday. Why on Sunday? Because the Jewish merchants, many of them, were Orthodox Jews who have Saturday as their Sabbath and close the stores on Saturday, but the city government allowed them to open their stores on Sunday at a time when stores in general were not allowed to be open on Sunday. This was until the 1950s or 60s. But in the 1980s, the Merchants Association was allowed to close the street on Sundays. So the street promoted itself as a bargain shopping district on Sunday when many people are free from work and could shop. I don't think that that was very successful because of the continued competition from the big box discount stores, and again the continued retirement and death of the older owners. So very, very gradually, the older stores began to close, but they were replaced by stores catering to the downtown artists and musicians community in the 1990s. So at that time, we began to see some bars, some cafes open on Orchard Street, perhaps also some clothing stores that didn't sell discount clothes, but sold vintage clothes, not expensive clothes for young people who wanted a more individual style, not exactly Harajuku, but sort of like that. So the character of the street began to change, not only because of the different immigrants who were opening stores there, but also because the artists and musicians who were living in downtown Manhattan began to shop there too, or at least began to go to bars and cafes and some stores there. By the 2000s, the artists and art gallery owners became a bigger presence, so that now we have 7 art galleries on a fairly small street. We also have, for the past 20 years, a museum called the Tenement Museum, which opened in 2 of the buildings on the street. And the point of this historical museum is to show the way immigrants lived in the late 19th century. So we have a museum, which is the major institution on the street. We have the beginnings of a cluster or a group of art galleries. And we also have cafes, a very special sort of espresso bar. We have a few restaurants. We have clothing boutiques that are fairly expensive, that sell the work of new designers, hat designers as well as clothing designers. So the character, and we also have a hotel that that presents itself as being designed in the style of the old tenements of the Lower East Side, even though the people who stay there are not poor people.
我々今ですね、イーストビレッジのさらに南にあるローアーイーストサイドの地区に来てますね。でローアーイーストサイドもこのオーチャードストリートっていうところに来てるんですけれども、ここは昔は繊維問屋が多く、あったところで、いくつかですねまだそういう、昔から、この100年ぐらい前からですね創業している店もありますけれども、ここもですね、ちょっとイーストビレッジとかに近いということもあって、ジェントリフィケーションがある程度見られ始めてますね。で新しくですね、ヒップというか、オルタナ系の店みたいなのも増え始めていると、イーストビレッジにですね、立地してたような店なんかもこのオーチャードストリートに多く、見られ始めていますね。でこのオーチャードストリートはですね歩行者天国、毎日曜日やってまして、朝の8時から6時までですね歩行者天国にしてるんですけれども、それも最近やられた施策ですね。でだから何かここをですねまた一つのこのニューヨークのですね新しい魅力をこう発現するような、場所としてですね位置づけようというふうな考えがあるんじゃないかなと思われます。
We have this shopping street that remains a shopping street, but increasingly it has an upscale character and a cultural character. It also markets itself as a shopping street for people who come from other countries to New York, and they come as tourists who want to spend money and they want to see an authentic Lower East Side street, but they don't want to buy the old products that were sold on the Lower East Side. They want to buy something modern and something individual, and they want to eat good food. So we have a very changing more cultural demand for certain kinds of styles and products. And we also have people coming from overseas, especially to the art galleries, people buying on the internet, not even coming in person. And we have a very different kind of street that presents itself as the little Ginza, more or less, the little main street of a very different neighborhood. Because at the same time, during the past 10 years, new apartment houses have been built on the Lower East Side, around Orchard Street, and even on Orchard Street, that are very expensive and completely different from the historical character and the historical residents of the street. So you have, living in the same district, residents of public housing projects with low incomes, people who live in the tenements who may be new immigrants who also have low incomes, and people who are living in these new apartment houses who have very high incomes and have very different kinds of jobs. So you see on this local shopping street the face of gentrification, and also you see the reflection of a very different kind of globalization from the globalization that brought poor immigrants to New York in the late 19th century. It's a re-Europeanization of the street, but now the Europeans who come are art gallery owners from France or wealthy tourists from Japan or Australia. And when my students interviewed store owners and cafe owners, restaurant owners on this street, they said many of our customers come from overseas, and maybe they come once or twice a year to buy paintings or to buy clothes.
Wow, okay.
And it's a very different kind of street from the local shopping street that Orchard Street once was. I should also say that before 1940, there were people who shopped for food on Orchard Street, but there were few, if any, food stores. Mostly there were street vendors or peddlers who sold fruits, vegetables, meat, fish from carts on the street. But that was really the old days.
So who are these shops locally owned, or who owns these
Well, the
shops?
people who, yes, there we see also a new globalization of the street. We see in the newest stores and art galleries owners who come from Europe, from East Asia, and from other parts of the United States, not from New York. This was a very interesting change. And in fact, it reminds me of the French film by Agnès Varda, where she showed how many store owners in Paris come from outside Paris. Now the store owners, the new store owners on Orchard Street, come from California, Ohio, other parts of the United States. There are very few who are native New Yorkers, but they live in New York now. They live in New York. They may not. Some of them live on the Lower East Side. Some of them live in Brooklyn or in other parts of the city. And it's interesting too that the immigrants from Bangladesh or Pakistan or could be Egypt who opened stores on Orchard Street in the 1980s and 1990s find the rents expensive. But the newest store owners, restaurant owners, art gallery owners compare the rents on Orchard Street with the rents in other art gallery neighborhoods, and they don't find the rents expensive. So gradually, if the building owners raise the rents because they know they can find people to rent these spaces, the older store owners will be forced to shut down and move. Shut down or move.
So you don't see so much chain stores?
Oh, I should say that there are no visible chain stores on Orchard Street.
Why is that?
Well, let me step back. There's I say no visible chain stores. There is one optician that sells eyeglasses. That's a local chain. It's a New York chain. They have a few other places of business in New York City. And there's I think there's a clothing boutique that does not look like a chain, but when we spoke to the owner or the manager, she said that it's part of a Spanish business that has other branches. But you really cannot see that when you look at Orchard Street. Why is that? One reason is that the stores are very small. We say the footprint of each store is small. The size is very small. Chain stores usually prefer big spaces. And I'm not just talking about Walmart or IKEA that wants to have a big parking lot. I'm just talking about any chain really needs a high volume of turnover. So that's one reason you don't see many chains. The stores are small. Also, Orchard Street is not immediately immediately next to a subway station. So there is not much foot traffic. And indeed, during the day, there aren't very many people walking in the street, which is a problem for the stores on the street. Sometimes there are more people on the street after 6 o'clock in the evening when customers come to the bars and to the restaurants. So the rents are higher than in some other parts of the city, but the rents are low compared to other parts of Manhattan because of the lack of mass transportation immediately next to Orchard Street.
So, yeah.
It becomes more complicated because there are subway stations near Orchard Street, but we just don't have the foot traffic around Orchard Street.
So do you think the lack of chain stores help Orchard Street to have this kind of authenticity feeling? Or?
Well, it's a double-edged sword because the continued authentic character of the street keeps rents low, or it's connected to low rents, but it also attracts people who are searching for authenticity because they like the culture of the old city. They like the culture of individuality. But when they create new businesses on this street, those businesses reproduce the same culture you see in any city of the world. For example, one of the new bar restaurants on the street was designed to look exactly like a Mexican bar. In fact, it's a Mexican bar that specializes not in tequila, which is fairly common in the United States, but it specializes in mezcal, which is less common. I can't tell you exactly what the difference is, but there's a different process of producing it. And mezcal is regarded often as being a less refined product, a more rural product, and in a way a more authentic product because mezcal is connected with, let's say, peasants and in the countryside. But the bar is designed to look exactly like a bar in a city in Mexico, in Oaxaca, we were told in the interview with the manager. And there are 3 owners. One is a North American, a gringo, a U.S. person. The other 2 are Mexicans. So this is a very strange addition to Orchard Street because there were never any Mexicans living on Orchard Street, no Mexican store owners. There are many Mexican immigrants in New York, but not living around Orchard Street. So it's very strange to see a Mexican restaurant presenting itself as part of the authenticity of Orchard Street, but it's really presenting itself as authentically Mexican as well as authentically part of Orchard Street. So we see the entire character of the street changing in terms of the way it looks, the aesthetics, the design, in terms of the kinds of products that are sold there, and in terms of the kinds of people who are the clientele, the customers of Orchard Street.
But you still think that this DNA of neighborhood character has been kept?
Well, yes, in a way, because the new residents of the street are the kinds of cultural consumers who want to sample the different sorts of products. And many of the nighttime customers come to Orchard Street because they want to eat in a Mexican restaurant, or they want to eat in a Vietnamese restaurant, or they want to go to a certain bar. And this is one of the paradoxical characteristics of authenticity. It changes. It's always changing. The authenticity of the old Orchard Street gradually disappears, but a new authenticity takes its place. Sometimes we don't like the new authenticity. We may not like the old authenticity. Sometimes we don't like the new authenticity. And it does seem to me that the new authenticity of many cities is an authenticity of transients, not of residents, of people who visit the city, not of people who live in that place.
But there's, I think, do you think there's I think there seems to be a lot of cities that lacks this authenticity.
I think this is a universal problem because the universal culture of this kind of cultural consumption you can find everywhere. You can walk down the street in Amsterdam or Paris or London or perhaps in Tokyo or Shanghai definitely, and find these kinds of stores, whether they're chains on some streets or they are the individual unusual boutiques or cafes. They're not so unusual because you find the same kinds of places all over. And in fact, that becomes a source of comfort for many people because this is the culture that they're used to. And they say, here's a Mexican restaurant, here's a Vietnamese restaurant, here's a cafe with a really complex espresso machine or coffee roasting machine, and they feel comfortable in those kinds of consumption spaces. So even though I regret the loss of the old authenticity, as a sociologist, I can see the beginnings of the new authenticity.
But I think in a certain neighborhood, you can are able to generate these new authenticity. But I see some neighborhoods that doesn't have this potential or energy to create new authenticity. And what makes these difference?
What makes the difference between neighborhoods?
Neighborhood who could create these new authenticity?
Well, first of all, it has to be easy to, in a society or in a city, it has to be easy to start a business. And people, we all say that the costs of entry in small business are very low. Also, the failure rate is very high. So it may be easy, but it's a risky procedure to process to open a small business. There have to be people who have a need to be cultural entrepreneurs as well as economic entrepreneurs. In other words, many people who start these individualistic kinds of businesses want to serve a cultural community that they identify with. In the old days, maybe the entrepreneurs didn't even think about their cultural functions. But these days, when so many new business owners are selling art or cocktails or vintage clothing or another product that can be described as a cultural commodity, cultural product, the store owners really do think of themselves as the organizers of a cultural movement, catering to the needs of people who have very specific needs in common. And often the business owners are members of this community. They themselves are artists or designers, but at some point they decide they want to open a business. If they're designers, they want a place to sell their designs. If they're painters, they may not be so successful as painters, or they may be more entrepreneurial than other painters, and they want to start a gallery to market works of art. But often when you speak to new business owners like that, they say, we are trying to serve our community. But their community is not a community of low-income, working-class residents of that district. Their community is people who share a certain kind of cultural capital. They have certain resources, certain education, certain tastes that require different kinds of businesses, different kinds of stores, restaurants, and so on. And serving this cultural community means you do not have a space to serve the old cultural community. And you see that conflict between old tastes and new tastes fought out on a shopping street, even though it's not a conflict, a physical conflict or a political conflict. You see the conflict of tastes in the changes from one kind of store to another. And this is something that I wrote about in Naked City when I wrote about Williamsburg in Brooklyn, also Harlem, and the East Village. So many neighborhoods in Manhattan and Brooklyn, and possibly beginning also in Queens, are going through this kind of change from an economic and a cultural base of the old residents to an economic and cultural base of new residents and tourists and people who come to New York once or twice a year to go shopping, to see the new art, to see the new restaurants, to sample the culture of New York.
Okay.
They have a very different kind of job, different kind of perspective.